We are going to be presenting for our final project for Classics 232 Section B. This is our final project. It will be on Immortals, a modern adaptation of the story of Theseus. This is
Seda.
I'm Hafsa.
I'm Portia.
We will all be discussing various things that we find important in the movie and how it relates to mythology. To start us off, we'll have Seda.
Alright, so I'm going to start off by talking about how gods were portrayed in the movie versus what we read. To begin, I'm going to talk about how gods were portrayed in the readings that we've done so far in mythology. Zeus was often portrayed as someone that got away with everything. He was a god of gods. He just had different levels of, an embodiment of different qualities, but it wasn't just, positives or just negatives. It was a combination of both. Athena was, the virgin. She was Zeus's daughter, but essentially she was half of Zeus because she was made out of, she was from his brain or half of his brain. And she was a goddess of warrior, and she was often portrayed as someone that she was very angelic because she was a virgin and she was Zeus's daughter, but she was also very headstrong and she knew what she wanted. If she was in war, she was in war. This is what she wanted to do, and that's how she did it. Ares was the god of war. He, in the hymns that we read, he was often there or he was referred to, but he was never someone that spoke himself or we learned much about as an individual. Poseidon was, of course, he always had his Triton. He was the god of oceans and earthquakes, but any natural disaster, essentially. And those were just the different qualities that each god portrayed within the readings that we had. Do you guys want to add on to anything about that, or no? You're good. All right. And one key thing is that they were all in their own elements within the readings. If Poseidon was, somewhere else, it would be in the oceans or something like that. It wouldn't be at Olympus just hanging around with the other gods. And same thing with Ares and, all the other people as well. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the characteristics of the gods in the movie. Zeus was very fatherly, and he was a positive role model. And one thing that you can't really get out of the movie or the readings was just that in the movie, at least, he was portrayed as someone that was very young, which reading about Zeus, I would never have imagined that, or for a god in general, I would never imagine to be someone very attractive, and very and Athena was very angelic. She was daddy's little girl, Zeus's. She was delicate, powerless, almost because she was daddy's girl. She never really had her own voice. If she did, it was very subtle. Ares was very silent. You didn't really hear much from him throughout the movie at all. And so was Poseidon. The only time he did mention anything or spoke vocally was when he helped out Theseus, but it was only for 2 seconds. Other than Zeus and Athena, you never really heard from the gods as characters themselves. And one key thing that I'd like to mention here is that the women in the movie were very, very oppressed to some degree, because whether that was Athena, who was a god, or someone that was a human, or oracle like Phaedra, they were very oppressed. Athena, of course, in the readings and knowing about mythology, we get that she's a warrior essentially, even though she is very angelic. But she's very headstrong and very independent. But in the movie, she was always dependent on Zeus, and she was always around Zeus. And there was never really a defining moment of just Athena. It was always with Zeus. And he would always, if Zeus did say something to Athena, it was very fatherly like and had no consequences to it, whereas realistically in the readings there would have been. And for Phaedra, she was very sexualized. Phaedra was very sexualized in various different forms. And she was oppressed in the sense that yes, she was an oracle and knew what was going to happen, but besides that, there was no other feature. Whether that was someone who could fight in war, which is one thing that we know she doesn't do that, but just as a woman itself, she was also one of those characters that had no defining power. And even though she was an oracle and that was her power to know the future, it was very, very downplayed. She didn't want to be an oracle, nor did Theseus really give value to it. He said, yes, you can see into the future, but you can't change it, so what's the point of having it? So just different things like that. And one of the companions during the time when they escaped also just referred to Phaedra as, just another woman, another whore. So just different things like that where women are also very downplayed. And the idea behind Hera not being mentioned at all in this movie was very important to me, just because she is a very strong goddess, and her not being in this movie or in the story is one thing, but just not portrayed in the movie at all, I felt like there was a missing component from the goddesses, and that's my interpretation of how the gods were interpreted in the movie. Now, being able to distinguish the gods is another story. We often had many conversations about this afterwards because we felt like, besides Poseidon and Athena and Zeus, of course, you didn't really know who anyone else was. You knew who Poseidon was because the Triton and his headpiece had fishes, and you knew who he was. And Athena, she was the only girl in the film, or only goddess, and Zeus bluntly referred to her as Athena, so you knew that was her. Mm-hmm. So you knew it wasn't Hera, you knew it wasn't Aphrodite or anyone else, in the introduction at least. Mm-hmm. But later on you do understand that it is Athena. Zeus, it's Zeus. We all know who he is. But besides someone saying that was Zeus, there was no other quality oriented or related to Zeus as we know him in the readings. Mm-hmm. And the other gods like Apollo or Ares, or we were often confused as to who was who. For Apollo and Ares, for example, we thought Apollo was Ares in the movie, but it turned out it was Ares the entire time. And the way we knew that or thought that was is because of his headpiece. Just looking at the headpiece in general without thinking too much of it, you would just think that, they're rays of sunshine or whatever you want to call it. But if you look into detail, it's swords, which we didn't know that at all. We actually had to look into that to make sure we knew who the characters were. And that was one of the key defining ways of us realizing that we don't really know who's who if you're a regular moviegoer. But if you know mythology, you just kind of question it a bit. Everyone was white. Which, I mean, I understand, at least for me, when I think of a god, just how commercialized it is, I assume it's someone white. And I assume it's someone very old. But in the movie, because they were all white and because they were all young, there was no way to know, besides Zeus, Athena, and Poseidon, there was no way to know who was who.
But they do the same in the Greek mythology. There's a hint of racism in it, and so I guess they're trying to follow that same path. But I would think in the more modern world, they would try to avoid that.
They just did not do a very good job with casting because they picked people that were all blonde-haired, blue-eyed, very pale. So it didn't really matter if you were male or female, you still blended in with everybody else.
Yeah, and just for cast purposes, or for movie purposes, I would want to know who I'm looking at. I mean, I'm not someone who thinks that, all white people look alike, but the way they were all in the movie, at least, and you got a glimpse of them, so you didn't really see them entirely.
Especially if they're supposed to be important castmates, I feel like either you're going to distinguish them by look or at least by name and mention it, but since they mentioned no names, we only had glimpses and faces of people. So
besides Zeus and Poseidon, everyone else was blonde hair, blue eye. Zeus and Poseidon had dark hair and dark features, but that was about it. Everyone else was, very angelic and pretty, but in other ways, just the headpieces were what we thought we could used as a way to distinguish the gods, but it really wasn't.